The envelope had been sitting in my coat pocket for 11 days. I kept touching it through the fabric, just to make sure it was still there, the way you'd check a wound that hasn't healed yet. A plain white envelope, letter-sized, the kind you pick up at Staples for $12 a box. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 14 lines, a summary of everything I'd spent 41 years building, reduced to a legal description and a signature block. My son didn't know I had it. Neither did his wife. That's what I want to tell you about. Not just what happened on Boxing Day, though that's where this story cracks open, but everything that came before it. The way a family can slowly become something you don't recognize, and how long a man can convince himself he's just imagining things. My name is Theodore. I'm 68 years old. For 34 years I worked as a licensed insolvency trustee in the province of Ontario, which is a fancy way of saying I helped people untangle financial disasters for a living. I've seen bankruptcy files, hidden assets, fraudulent transfers, people who moved money to relatives to avoid creditors and thought no one would ever notice. I know how these things work. I know how people lie on paper. That knowledge didn't save me from my own family. My wife, Elaine, passed away in the spring of 2021. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There's no way to describe those 14 weeks that doesn't sound inadequate, so I won't try. What I will say is that we were married for 40 years, and I have not had a single morning since where I didn't reach for her before I was fully awake and feel the absence like a cold draft through a broken window. After she died, I kept the house. 42 years old, a 4-bedroom on Ferndale Drive in Barrie, paid off in full, worth somewhere between $750,000 and $800,000, depending on who you asked and what the market was doing that week. Our retirement account, the thing Elaine and I had tended together like a garden. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is, even now, came to see me about 3 months after the funeral. He sat at the kitchen table where his mother used to drink her morning coffee, and he said, "Dad, you can't live in this house alone. You're going to fall. You're going to forget to take your medication." He said it with concern in his voice, and I believed the concern was real, so I didn't push back the way I might have otherwise. His wife came with him. She sat beside him and nodded at everything he said, and occasionally touched his arm. She'd always been pleasant enough, reserved, the kind of person who is polite to your face, and you can never quite tell what's underneath. They proposed that I move in with them. They had a house in Innisfil, newer, smaller, a split level on a cul-de-sac, and there was a spare bedroom on the main floor, no stairs required. My son said they'd love to have me. His wife said she'd make sure I had everything I needed. I told them I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks and then I said yes. In retrospect, I understand that this is where I made my first mistake. Not because wanting family nearby is wrong. It isn't, but because I made the decision while I was still raw from grief, still disoriented, still not fully myself. I was 66 years old and I had just lost the person who had been the organizing principle of my adult life, and my son offered me a place to belong, and I said yes without reading the fine print. I kept my house. I want to be clear about that. I rented it to a young couple, teachers, steady income, for $2,200 a month. I didn't sell it. Something in me refused to sell it. Whether that was wisdom or just sentiment, I still don't know. But I signed a lease, and I held on to those keys, and that decision would matter more than I understood at the time. The first year was manageable. My son worked from home 3 days a week. His wife worked full-time as a dental hygienist, and they had 2 kids, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, who I genuinely loved spending time with. I took the grandchildren to school twice a week. I made dinner on Tuesday nights. I kept out of the way otherwise. But sometime around the 2nd year, things started shifting in ways that were hard to name. Small things first. My son began making comments about the house on Ferndale. Not aggressive, never aggressive, just offhand. Things like, Dad, it's a lot of maintenance to be managing a rental from a distance. Or, have you thought about what happens to the equity when you're gone? Who deals with all of that? Once he asked if I had a will, and when I said yes, he said he hoped it was updated, and then he changed the subject before I could respond. The conversation moved on, but the question stayed in the room. His wife started commenting on how much I ate. That sounds petty, and I know it sounds petty. But if you've ever had someone track what you put on your plate at every meal, subtle remarks about sodium, gentle suggestions about portion size, a look exchanged between spouses when you reached for seconds. You understand that it isn't about food. It's about who has authority over your body, who's in charge. She began referring to me, in conversations I was meant to overhear, as a lot of work. I heard her on the phone with her mother once. "He's a lot of work, Mom. You have no idea." I had not, to my knowledge, been any particular amount of work. I washed my own laundry. I paid for my own prescriptions. I contributed $800 a month toward household expenses. My son had suggested it. I had agreed immediately, and I asked for very little in return. But somewhere between month 18 and month 24, I had become, in the vocabulary of that household, a burden. The children were the clearest mirror. Children always are. By the third year, my granddaughter had begun knocking on my bedroom door before entering, which I might have found appropriate except that she'd never done it before, and no one had asked her to, which meant someone had. My grandson stopped asking me to play with him in the backyard. He wasn't unfriendly. He was just distant in the particular way a child becomes when the adults around them have communicated, without words, that a person is not quite part of things anymore. I started keeping notes in November of 2023. This is going to sound paranoid, and I understand that. But after 34 years of watching people move money and hide assets and construct paper trails that meant exactly the opposite of what they appeared to mean, you develop a reflex. You pay attention to patterns. And the pattern I was observing in that split-level house on the cul-de-sac was one I recognized from files I'd worked on professionally. The slow repositioning of an older person as incompetent, as unreliable, as a problem to be managed. My son began asking about my medications more frequently than was necessary. He started coming with me to doctor's appointments, uninvited, and asking my GP questions in a tone that suggested he wasn't sure I would give accurate answers on my own. In February of 2024, he asked me, gently, if I'd ever considered whether living on my own again might be getting beyond me. I said I was living with family, not on my own. He said he meant in terms of independence, cognitive independence. He used the phrase cognitive independence without any apparent awareness of how it sounded. I wrote it down when I got back to my room. Date, time, exact wording. The way I used to document phone calls with creditors. His wife began making suggestions about the house on Ferndale around the same time. Not suggestions, overtures. She mentioned a friend of hers who was a real estate agent. She said the rental market was unpredictable, and it seemed like a lot of stress for someone my age. She said the equity could give me real security, real options. The word options came up repeatedly, in different conversations, as though it had been decided in advance that options was the word to use. I want to be fair. I want to be honest with you about what I actually knew versus what I suspected. At this point, I suspected. I didn't know my son and his wife had not done anything I could point to directly. They had been in most observable ways attentive. They drove me to appointments. They included me at the dinner table. They bought me a very good winter coat for Christmas. A person looking at the surface of our life together would have seen a devoted family caring for an aging father. What I saw underneath was something else. But I wrote it down, and I waited. Boxing Day 2024 was a Saturday. We'd had a quiet Christmas. My daughter had flown in from Vancouver for 3 days, which I will come back to, because she matters in this story more than anyone. And by the 26th, the house had settled back into its usual rhythms. The grandchildren were playing with new toys. My son was watching hockey in the living room. His wife was cleaning up the kitchen. I was at the dining room table going over some documents. Property tax records for the Ferndale house, the updated lease renewal. When my son came in and sat across from me, he didn't say anything for a moment. He watched me organize the papers, and then he said, "Dad, we need to talk about something." His wife appeared in the doorway almost immediately, which told me this had been planned. They sat across from me at the table where we ate Christmas dinner the night before, and they told me, calmly, with what they clearly believed was compassion, that they thought it was time for me to sell the Ferndale property. They said the rental income wasn't really significant given what the home was worth. They said that if I invested the proceeds properly, I could generate a stronger return and simplify my affairs considerably. My son said, and I wrote this down afterward word for word, "Dad, you're 68. You shouldn't be managing a property. Let us help you simplify things." His wife said they had already spoken to her friend, the real estate agent, who thought the timing was excellent. I asked them who would benefit from the sale. There was a pause. My son said, "You would, Dad, obviously." I said, "And would there be any expectation that a portion of the proceeds would come to you?" Another pause. Longer. His wife said that naturally, as his father, I might want to consider the family's future, and that it made more sense to help while I was still in good health than to leave everything to an estate process. I looked at my son. He looked at the table. I said I would think about it. What I did not say, what I sat with quietly, the way I used to sit with files that were going to unravel slowly, was that I had already thought about it. I had been thinking about it since November of 2023. And in October of 2024, 8 weeks before Boxing Day, I had met with my solicitor and made a series of decisions about the Ferndale property and about my estate that my son knew nothing about. I also did not mention my daughter. Here is what I need to tell you about my daughter, because she is the reason any of this has an ending worth talking about. She is 34 years old. She lives in Vancouver with her husband and works as a family mediator, which I did not fully appreciate the significance of until she came home for Christmas. She has her mother's way of watching a room, taking everything in, saying nothing until she has something worth saying. She had been home for exactly 36 hours when she pulled me aside and asked me, very quietly, whether everything was all right. I told her things were fine. She said, "Dad, I'm watching things. Things aren't fine." I told her some of what I'd been observing. Not all of it. I didn't want to alarm her or pull her into something without being sure. But enough. And her response was not what I expected. She didn't get emotional. She didn't dismiss it. She got very still, the way her mother used to get when she was working something out. And then she said, "Has anyone mentioned anything to you about a power of attorney?" They hadn't. Not directly. She said, "That's coming, Dad. That's where this goes." She stayed 2 extra days. I didn't ask her to. She extended her flight on her own without telling her brother. On the morning of December 24th, while my son and his wife were out with the grandchildren, she sat with me at the kitchen table, and we talked for 3 hours. I showed her my notes. She didn't look surprised. She looked sad. She said, "You know I support whatever you decide, but I want you to know that you don't owe anyone an explanation for the choices you make about your own property." That was a very precise thing to say. I wrote it down. On Boxing Day, after my son and his wife made their proposal about Ferndale, after I said I would think about it and they went back to the living room, I went to my room and called my daughter in Vancouver. She'd flown home the day before. She answered on the second ring. She said, "How did it go?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, now we do the next part." The next part had already been set in motion as I said in October, but there were still a few pieces to put in place. My daughter had connections through her work. Family law mediators know a great many people in adjacent professions, and she had, over the past several months, helped me consult with a family law solicitor and an independent financial advisor. What I had done with my solicitor in October was this. I had placed the Ferndale property in a family trust, a Henson-style trust structure, modified for my particular circumstances, naming my daughter as trustee and my grandchildren as ultimate beneficiaries. The trust was registered. It was legal. It was, by any professional assessment I had obtained, watertight. I had also updated my power of attorney documents, naming my daughter as attorney for both property and personal care. My son was removed. My doctor had provided documentation, at my request, following a comprehensive cognitive assessment, which I had sought out independently, confirming that I had full decision-making capacity. That documentation was dated 6 weeks prior to Boxing Day, and I had written a letter, addressed to my son, 12 paragraphs, single-spaced, printed on paper I'd bought at Staples. I'd been working on it since November. I'd revised it 11 times. It said everything I would have otherwise been unable to say out loud without my voice going somewhere. I didn't want it to go. I didn't mail the letter right away. In January, my son brought up the Ferndale property again. I said I was still considering my options. His wife mentioned the real estate agent's name for the 3rd time. I wrote it down. In February, my son asked if I'd given any thought to whether my current living arrangement was really the best thing long-term. He phrased it as a concern about my independence. I told him I had, in fact, given it considerable thought. He said, "Dad, We love having you here, but we've been talking about what's best for you. His wife nodded. She said that in a couple of years the kids would need more space and that they wanted to be honest with me about the situation. I looked at her. I said, I appreciate your honesty. Then I said, I have some honesty for you as well. I went to my room and came back with the envelope. I set it on the table. My son picked it up. He opened it. He read it. His wife leaned in to read over his shoulder, and I watched her face change. Not dramatically, not a collapse, but a careful withdrawal. The kind of expression a person makes when they understand that something they planned is not going to happen. The letter explained, in plain language, what I had done in October: the trust, the updated power of attorney, the cognitive assessment, the fact that I had been keeping notes since November of 2023, dated and time-stamped, of every conversation in which the Ferndale property, or my cognitive capacity, or my estate arrangements had been raised. The fact that I had consulted, independently, with a solicitor and a financial advisor, and that those consultations were documented. The fact that my daughter was named trustee, attorney for property, and attorney for personal care. And then, at the end of the letter, I explained that I had decided on my own, without consultation, and with full legal and cognitive capacity, that I would be returning to Barry in 30 days. The tenants at Ferndale had given notice in December. The house would be vacant by March 1st. I had arranged for a contractor to come in for minor repairs. I would be moving back into my own home. I told them I did not require assistance with packing. I told them I was grateful for the time I had spent with my grandchildren, which was true and which I wanted them to know was true, because whatever had happened between the adults in this family was not something I was going to take out on two small children who had nothing to do with it. My son didn't speak for a long time. When he did, he said my name, just my name, and then stopped. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to find the version of the situation in which you're still the reasonable party and you can't quite get there. His wife left the room. I said, I'm not angry. I want you to know that. I'm disappointed, but I'm not angry. And I'd like us to find a way through this that doesn't make things worse than they need to be. He said, Dad, we were just trying to help. I said, I know you think that. I'm not sure it's entirely true, but I know that's how it feels to you. And I'm not here to argue about intentions. I'm here to tell you what I've decided. I moved back to Ferndale on the 28th of February. My daughter flew in from Vancouver to help. She brought her husband. They arrived on a Thursday evening, and the four of us spent the weekend putting the house back in order, airing it out, moving furniture, unpacking the things I'd had in storage. It was cold, the way only a Barry February can be cold, and we ordered pizza both nights and ate it on the floor of the living room because the dining table was still pushed against the wrong wall. It was the best weekend I'd had in 2 years. My son and I have spoken 3 times since then. The conversations have been short and careful, the way conversations are when both people are waiting to see whether there's something left to build on. I don't know yet. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that I am 68 years old, and I live in my own house, and my name is on my own documents, and no one is suggesting to my doctor that I might have trouble remembering things. My granddaughter sent me a drawing in the mail last week, a house with a green roof and a stick figure in front of it. She spelled my name wrong but got close enough. I put it on the refrigerator. My daughter calls every Sunday. We don't always talk about what happened. Sometimes we talk about nothing, what she had for dinner, what I watched on television, whether I've shoveled the walk yet. Those calls are, I think, her way of checking that I'm all right. My way of confirming the same thing about her. I have a folder in my filing cabinet, the one beside my desk in the room that used to be a home office and is one again, labeled simply with the year. In it is a copy of the trust documents, the power of attorney, the cognitive assessment, my solicitor's letter of advice, and every page of the notes I kept between November 2023 and February 2025. 47 pages in total. I don't know if I'll ever need them for anything, but I know they're there, and so do the people who needed to know.